more information to you on what we're trying to do here. The idea is to try to find a way for the city to get some early occupancy on a number of facilities. You have a lot of things on your plate that you're trying to get put in place, as a lot of growing communities have, so we're looking for some new approaches to be able to get these facilities brought online sooner and pay for them over time after you're already occupying them. One of the first steps is going to be to come up with a plan for site acquisition, and there's been a couple of responses back through your RFI process on sites for the public works yard, but some of the ideas behind early site acquisition are to benefit from a lower purchase price. Of course, land prices continue to escalate, so the longer we wait before we start acquiring sites, the higher they're going to be. The potential to get enough land, an adequate enough site for future expansion needs is incredibly important. There may be an opportunity to acquire sites without financing or without a cash outlay by the city under certain conditions. There's the opportunity on some of these sites to do some additional development that might subsidize the municipal facilities in the way of private development that would subsidize the costs. And the potential for joint development of infrastructure to minimize the costs, again, trying to reach a critical mass of the things that are needed to support a lot of development, thereby lowering the cost for everybody. Pre-development expenses are one of the other things that we try to find a way to defer. An opportunity to expedite the planning and design work. If there's not funding available, there's some ways to advance those tasks. The potential to reduce or eliminate interest expense utilizing existing funding. That's one of the decisions to make, is you've got some money available perhaps to do some of this preliminary work as opposed to financing it. It's a decision that's a business decision that you'll have to make at some point. An opportunity to develop an early guaranteed maximum price, knowing what these facilities are going to cost early on in the process, so if they are over budget, you can make kind of strategic changes without impacting the design terribly. These are a couple of different approaches that traditionally have been used for these kinds of facilities, and most of you are probably acquainted with these. The most traditional is the design bid build, where through separate contracts you go out and you design the project, you then put it out to bid, and then you award the bid and you build it. That has some negatives with it, one being that until bid day you don't truly know what the cost is going to be, and you're really full risk for doing that. It's often the slowest and most expensive process because you do have to go through quite a significant procurement process in each one of these pieces. One of the pluses is you've got absolute control throughout the process. It's also the most traditional, the most widely accepted method of doing public facilities. Design build is something that you may also be acquainted with that sort of helps this process along a little bit, but you do have to wait for complete funding before you can execute the project, so that means you're going to have cash in the bank and spend that money when you've got enough of it. Again, you're going to assume full risk on the thing. There's a slight cost advantage because you do have a relationship between the designers and the constructors early on in the process, so they can kind of guide each other as in the decision-making process, and hopefully you come out with a more advantageous cost. And you do also get a slight schedule advantage because you're compressing some of these tasks and paralleling some of them rather than being in a sequential approach. These are some of the ways that we would suggest you consider to get these things done sooner and perhaps less expensive. And the term here, these alternative transaction structures offer an opportunity to deliver needed facilities sooner with potential of lower costs and greater flexibility in funding. So you have a lot of answers earlier on using some of these, and examples would be developer build-to-suit, privatized lease-to-own. This has become very popular with the state of Arizona. It's how a lot of the state's office buildings are getting done now. A developer build-to-suit, city lease purchase financed. That's kind of a hybrid where you'd go through kind of the traditional steps, but you would, once you determined all the specifications for the facility you'd need, you would then turn it over to a developer to build it to your specifications and deliver it to you on a lease with a purchase option basis. And the third is a lease-leaseback through a nonprofit development entity, which in many ways is the most efficient mechanism because there isn't a profit or a value added or a value creation opportunity for the developer nor are you using private funds, so there's not a return on investment component in the pricing. Let's talk a little bit more in detail about developer build-to-suit, privatized, lease-to-own. As this points out, the state of Arizona is beginning to use this a lot. They've done a couple of office buildings this way. The new Arizona Game and Fish headquarters was procured this way. In many cases, you're not going to pay anything until the day you accept and occupy the building. So you defer a lot of these front-end costs. Those are borne on the back of the developer, and the developer is going to incur most of the risk on delivering you a facility within the cost and the time parameters that you put in place. Typically, these transactions have an annual purchase option, including a day one purchase option, which would be the day that the facility is done and you accept it. You could just write a check for a predetermined amount if you chose to do that. If you didn't choose to do that, then you'd have annual payments that would go out up to 25 or 30 years, perhaps, that you could retire on any annual basis at a predetermined purchase price. In a lot of the state buildings now, they're considering what they call life cycle costing. And what that does is it puts in the hands of the private sector a lot of the operational and maintenance issues on the building envelope, a lot of the critical systems. It takes out of what often is the case where you're having to project out what year do you think you'll have to put a new roof on, what year will you have a chiller. These instead have an annual cost basis that kind of is a maximum, and somebody's going to assume that risk, somebody that's theoretically more appropriately schooled in managing these buildings than would be the public agency, and therefore can take on the risk. You have a guaranteed annual cost of occupancy, very critical because, again, you're trying to take this what-if scenario out of your annual budgets, and the developer assumes all the risk. Now, you give up a couple of things in doing this, obviously. The costs are determined by the private sector, and there's some profit requirement typically in that. And the control by the city may be reduced from the standpoint that somebody else is taking on the risk, and they are kind of your partner in developing these things. So you do give up some level of control, but that usually can be mitigated.
Can you give an example of that level of control?
You don't have absolute control over the design, for example. You would have control over the important aspects of the design, the kind of space, the type of space, the materials, perhaps, but the method of construction, and some of those things are left up to the team to propose to you because they're giving you a cost proposal that they're controlling the design, they're controlling the method of construction and those kinds of things. So in the best scenario, it's kind of a partnership that they're reflecting truly your desires and wishes, but you do leave some control to them to make discretionary changes to keep the project within budget, but they typically don't affect quality or schedule and things like that. Developer build-to-suit with a city lease purchase. This would most often be paid for through a financing, a public financing, typically a tax-exempt, municipal-backed kind of financing. There's an option for no payment until you accept the facility. The option, again, of retiring on an annual basis. If you chose to retire the debt on it, you could do that on an annual basis. It offers a lot of the advantages of the developer build-to-suit from the standpoint that you're shedding a lot of the risk, and you're putting that in the hands of the private sector developer who can more appropriately perhaps manage those things. And it may offer a cost of funds advantage because you're using municipal financing as opposed to private sector money that probably is more expensive and also in often cases demands a return on that. Some of the negatives perhaps are you do have some financial risk because it is the city's financing and the city's credit that you're using. The costs determined by the private sector do include sometimes some profit motive, and you again are relinquishing some control of the project to the developer, but again you can mitigate most of those. What we think is, for many projects, the best mousetrap today is a lease back through a nonprofit entity, in which case you're going to create, or the development team is going to create a nonprofit entity that is going to have a very transparent kind of facilitation of this development process. All the money flows through a trustee, it's auditable, the development team is going to be paid on a fee-only basis, so there's not a profit motive, there's not a return on investment, there's not a value creation opportunity. It's very appropriate for pure public buildings that are publicly financed. Again, it's built to the city specification. There should be quite a lot of interaction with the city on the design side. The city would lease the completed facility from this nonprofit entity for a term up to 30 years. Again, you've got the option to purchase at any point during the transaction. Again, it's a very transparent kind of transaction that in a lot of cases brings a lot of comfort to people because they don't know what goes on within the development process. This opens all that up so that it's a very open process and everybody can see what's going on. Because there's no profit or return demanded by the nonprofit, by definition, is usually the most cost-effective approach to this because there's not someone in it that's getting anything out of it other than fees, and those are declared up front. The nonprofit can also provide long-term property management functions. This is particularly important if you've got a mixed-use project that does include some private sector or some other agencies that use your facility. This nonprofit can be kind of the sovereign owner and operator of this facility on your behalf that has a little easier time facilitating some of those project management tasks perhaps than the city does. It can provide a true arm's length transaction. It can get it completely away from city procurement and give you the most efficient privatized kind of development. And it gives you, again, the long-term flexibility in how you pay for it, allowing you to pay for it over time if you choose to do that. Here's a lease-leaseback example. Lease-leaseback has become very commonplace in California. There's specific legislation that allows K-12 school districts to utilize this. This is a project that I was acquainted with. There was a new high school, a $60 million projected project cost. The developer provided the financing on this rather than the school district. The school district entered into a lease that leased their site to the developer, and the developer had a lease back to the district that had a day one purchase option and also the opportunity to spread those payments out over several years if they needed to. In this case, because the developer had a lot of control over how they paid and how the process went, it was delivered 2 months ahead of schedule, which is virtually unheard of. And after the development team and the school district shared in the cost savings for the project, everyone had a contingency. So the school district had a contingency to utilize for changes that they wanted to make. The developer had a contingency to do things that they thought appropriate, and then there was a project contingency beside that. At the end of that, there was a predetermined split in those cost savings, and so the school district in this case received $2.5 million back out of those cost savings. In this case, there was a 30-year financing. They retired it day one. All their monies were available as they had anticipated. Their bond measures had passed and such. And so they didn't need to use the long-term financing, but had any of these things not happened, they would have been able to fall back on that. And it gave them a lot of long-term flexibility during the couple of years that this development was taking place, so that they needed their cash to buy another piece of land or do something that required a cash position. They had the money to do that. It wasn't tied up in the building project.
What's a developer incentive for doing that type of thing?
It's fee and a percentage of the cost savings typically.
Percentage of the cost savings.
But they're typically declared fees, and then there's usually some savings split. A lot of times it'll include the design professionals, so they're cooperative through the process. And the idea is to have the whole development team that very comprehensively looks for the most efficient way to deliver the project all the way through, and the project becomes kind of king.
How do you determine savings?
The savings are from the guaranteed maximum price, which is the basis of the contract. You typically try to put enough contingency in there so you don't have to come back to the governing body to ask for change orders and things like that. You try to manage those things internally, and that's one of the cost advantages. The other cost advantage, quite frankly, is during busy times, this allows you to put money in the hands of the subtrades very quickly, and so you have a buying advantage. It's very difficult in boom times. It's very difficult to get the bidding environment to be attractive on public works projects. It's just the nature of the world. So that gives you the opportunity to bring in some tradespeople perhaps and get some performance out of them that otherwise you don't, because you can pay them quickly. Here's how a lease back through a nonprofit entity would work. You theoretically would have a site in mind, or you would have put in place some way to acquire and control a site. You would then enter into a fairly short-term lease with the development entity to build this facility if you thought you were going to buy it early on. If not, you'd enter into a longer-term ground lease that would extend to the maximum term of the financing. The nonprofit development entity builds the facility to the city specifications. And again, we try to develop a development team that includes the design professionals. Everybody's at the table from day one, working comprehensively to deliver the project successfully. The city then agrees to lease the facility for a term up to 30 years. The city has the option to purchase at any point during the term of the lease. Again, you're using a very transparent structure. This nonprofit has its own board of trustees, and typically that would be comprised of appointees by the city council. You typically don't want the city council to be that board, because then you're back into the world of procurement that the city is constrained by. The day-to-day management of the nonprofit is provided on a fee basis, so there's not a burden on city staff. No profit or other return is demanded by the nonprofit development entity. The most efficient, lowest cost, and typically shortest period to occupancy. Again, you can provide the long-term property management function, which may include, for example, if you found that you could contract out for some services at a more attractive rate, groundskeeping, pavement, a lot of these kinds of maintenance items, you would have the opportunity to have the nonprofit manage those things if you chose to do that. Again, it provides a true arm's length transaction for the project if you choose to do that, and the long-term flexibility in the financing. Similarly, that's what's happening. Okay. This is a slide that's probably a little hard for you to see unless you can get real close, and looks more complicated than it is, but let me try to walk you through it. Within the kind of dotted circle in that are all the activities that this development entity would undertake and control in the process. And so you can see that we've got the general contractor and the architect both responding to the nonprofit development entity. You've got typically a public financier that's providing the funding for this, and you've got a tax-exempt public facilities corporation that is actually the entity that leases to the city the finished facility and leases from the city the land. All the funding that the financier provides goes through the trustee. So the trustee is typically some independent third party that acts as an escrow agent, pays upon your instructions the bills as they come in, and this then results in a new facility being delivered to you pretty seamlessly from start to finish. You can see that within that there's some two-way arrows that are interaction between the nonprofit entity and the city, and between the nonprofit entity and the service providers. You typically put these together in such a way that all of the contracts for the project are written between the nonprofit entity and the service providers, so the city is completely outside the contracting per se, and this project entity is very specific for this project only, and its universe really is controlled by the parameters of this specific project. So that's kind of a typical transaction model that's very common in these. It again has the advantages of everybody's at the table day one, everybody's working seamlessly together, and the sole purpose to deliver a completed facility ahead of time and below budget.
Who typically acts as trustee? What have you seen?
Banks, some escrow companies do it, but typically it's a bank, and they run it through their escrow department. They do it for a fee, and you have very specific, the board of trustees would create very specific rules that you would have the architect sign off, you'd have the contractor sign off, you'd have your lien waivers, you'd have all those things before they would process a payment. But typically that's a very quick process, so again, you've got the buying advantage of being able to put money in the contractor's hands very quickly, but you've got somebody independent of the development entity handling the money.
Help me understand, because it all sounds very attractive, but help me understand the public procurement side of it in the sense that, I don't mean to take your comments out of context, but the arm's length transaction sure sounds like, we're taking responsibility off the seven of us or the fiscal agents, other fiscal agents of the city, and pushing that somewhere else. So how, outside of the auditing, how do we ensure accountability throughout the entire process?
Well, again, you do have absolute auditability, and these transactions are set up because they're almost always audited, so the audit trail is a very critical piece of this. The reason to get it arm's length away from the city is so that it can function much more like a private delivery. You don't have the constraints of a lot of process to make decisions on the fly.
Don't have 7 people telling you what to do.
Well, it's just that you don't have to wait for the next council meeting to make a decision, for example.
That's right.
Part of the way you gain ground on these things is the developer might choose to use his contingency to bring a crew in over the weekend, pay them overtime so they'd be ready for another trade to come in on Monday morning, for example. These are the little things that the private sector does all the time, but it's very difficult for public projects to enjoy these kinds of things. So it's largely out of convenience and efficiency that you try to get it arm's length away, but there may be other reasons as well. It may be that you have a concern about bumping up against debt limitations, those kinds of things. So there may be a number of reasons to try to get them to arm's length. But the main reason is you want this project entity to have a life of its own and be managed with your proper oversight, but not have this body have to make every single decision in a construction or development project.
So talk about conflict resolution a little bit in terms of what happens if the trustee disagrees with something that was made, a decision that was made at 5 o'clock on Friday to bring in a tradesperson, and they had an expense that they
the trustee wouldn't be involved in that. That would be the project team would be involved in it. The trustee really only has dealings with the transmittal of money from that account to the various providers. The conflict resolution, a lot of that goes away because you've got a development team that's all got the same agenda and they've all been together from the start to the finish. So you don't have a contractor who's bid on somebody else's work who he didn't know and then finds a flaw in it and has no reason not to go back and just point fingers. This gives you a much more seamless, everybody's together from day one, everybody's working towards a single goal, and you typically mitigate those problems as you go, but you've got a pretty concise group of people that can make decisions on the fly as it pertains to change orders. Very little paperwork, very little time. Time is money, and so that's how you typically save money and time is managing the process much more like the private sector does. So this has become the best blend between a pure private sector kind of relationship that you're going to pay something for, quite frankly, and having the best attributes of that, but being able to use the efficiencies of public finance.
It just seems like you'd have to have a really strong program manager, and it would be that program manager's responsibility. They keep coming back to us whenever there's any type of a critical issue. I guess, but we would not have any say-so in who that is.
Well, you probably would, because you can compete for any of these things. But most often you enjoy success by having somebody that knows who these people are, being able to pick and negotiate with the people that they want to have on the team, so you don't have people that don't have a good working relationship up front. The chemistry of this team is part of what you try to do. And so it's really very much like filling out an orchestra, that you get the best players you can, and then you have a conductor that can make all of them play at the same time. So you do have some level of control, and that's one of the things you can determine when you set this thing up is what actions do you have to return to council to get blessing on.
Now, go back to the land lease process.
Okay?
And what do you, just explain that a little.
Well, there's two different approaches. What you've done thus far is you've put out a solicitation for developers who own land that had an interest in providing the public works facility as one of the facilities we're talking about. In that case, they have land. They've provided you an opportunity to take a look at their land, where it's located, and also given you a scenario for 20 to 30-year financing on a project that's, to this point, to your specification. In that case, they're going to put forth the land, they're going to develop the project, they're simply going to ask you to execute a lease with them for some term, and you're going to be essentially a tenant, and they're going to be the landlord. And at some point in time, you can purchase it if you choose to do that. If not, at the end of the lease term, you probably can walk away. It's entirely dependent upon the terms of the lease. So it does give you some luxuries. In that case, you wouldn't be acquiring the land ahead of time. So that would simply be entering into a rather comprehensive agreement that seamlessly you'd have one entity providing you with a completed facility on land that they already controlled, and the whole thing gets blended together. In the scenario that this demonstrates, you're going to somehow acquire the land ahead of time. So the city is going to have control of the site. You're then going to lease your land to the nonprofit. They're going to lease back the finished facility.
That's better.
Still, I think,
Thank you.
can you get a copy of this presentation?
Can we have a copy of the presentation?
Sure.
Yeah, I can have it for you folks.
Okay.
Well, the reason that Public Works asked Ed to come up and talk to you was, one, because he realistically knows what he's talking about. And we actually brought him in front of you at our public safety study meet. And we thought it was best to bring somebody you were familiar with and that we were all comfortable with and knew what he was doing. What we're really asking council to do is to allow the Public Works Department to work closely with the Finance Department and the City Management Department to actually pursue these opportunities. And our full intentions is to come back to you with more specific information and be able to give you a better understanding. We wanted to give you the overview tonight and then come back after, after your break and bring you more detailed information. I know nothing's very specific, but we want to come back and we want to have that opportunity and your blessing to be able to move forward with these opportunities. And that's what we're asking from you tonight.
Are you going to come back with a recommendation?
Yes,
Of how
staff.
you think
Yes,
we should do it,
absolutely.
rather than just options?
Correct. Our public works staff and city management, finance, everybody's recommendation to how to look at maybe not one project, 2 projects, 3 projects. It could be all our projects. It could be just one project. It's based on, we have to look at the opportunities that Ed has presented to us and figure out which ones fit best and move forward with that.
Does this have any effect on, if you want to look at energy conservation or lead build or does that?
All those scenarios are actually what you would build into your development agreement. If that's specifically what you're wanting to do, when you're dealing with your developer, that would be incorporated into your GMP, and that would be a cost-saving scenario if you have your GMP and you run up against it where you were able to pull out the lead or keep the lead in. Those are options that you look at, and that's more of a fine line, lower elevation scenario.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm comfortable hearing options. I think it's a great idea. I think you've got multiple opportunities within the city. I mean, we're talking about City Hall P3 opportunities and a variety of other public-private partnership opportunities, and this just lends itself towards that. So I'm open to hearing them. I mean, if we can spread $1 across, what would typically be $10, then I'm all for it. We've got
You're getting
services
it
we
done.
need to provide, and we've got a constituency that's asking for those services yesterday, not today. And sure would be nice to get those up and going. I understand the answer to your question, though, correctly, that if we wanted a green building or a LEED certified building or something like that, we would build that into the bid up front.
We would negotiate that with the
You would
developer,
negotiate.
correct.
Okay.
And if we come down to a budget constraint where, if we're at $10, as you're saying,
Right.
and the lead's going to cost us $12, we have to evaluate, do we want to spend the extra $2 to go ahead and certify as a lead and evaluate that as an overall budget.
Okay, sounds like a consensus, full speed ahead. So
Thank you.
have at it.
Have a good night.
Thank you. Sean, I didn't see Sean. Oh, there he is.
Good evening, Mayor, members of the council. I'm here tonight to talk about utility services in Sonoran Valley. As we're starting to gear up, now that the annexation has been completed, we're starting to gear up our plans and planning for utility services in Sonoran Valley. I wanted to bring forward to you for your discussion and your information some of the options that we're looking at to provide service to, I guess, our future citizens in Goodyear. I just wanted to talk about the service area. We annexed a large parcel of land. I think it was about 66 square miles, and within that land, there was 2 areas that were going to be identified for development. The northern piece of land, that is the state land, will be provided through our existing infrastructure in the southern piece of Estrella. So that won't be anything different. We'll just essentially connect the pipes and tie that development into our existing infrastructure in Estrella. The piece that we're going to be talking about tonight is that more southern piece, and we'll get into that in a little bit of detail. As I get into this, feel free to ask a question, interrupt. Also tonight here is Tim Keenan and Garrett Weger from Montage. They'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you may have as well. There it is. So this is the service area. It's the lower, approximately 20,000 acres of developable land. This will be essentially a satellite service area for the city. We'll have independent, standalone utilities, water, wastewater, and reuse. As part of the planning, we've worked with Montage and have come up with a utility master plan. So we've already got some areas identified that are located on the map where we're going to be having some packaged wastewater treatment plants that will be converted into essentially a scalping plant and used for reuse. And then as the development continues, we'll have a larger regional facility. I think it's about 25 to 30 million gallons a day regional plant as we continue to reach build-out within the Sonoran Valley. So we're kind of full steam ahead. Now that we've got a good idea where our infrastructure is going to be, we wanted to start to talk about how it's going to be best served by the city. When we started to look into it, we came up with a few minimum requirements that we felt were necessary under any scenario. First being that it would be a municipal water and wastewater system. We weren't really interested in looking at a private service provider. We have that in the existing city, and I think the city's had some difficulties controlling growth and controlling those resources, so we felt it was best if we look at it from a municipal approach. Rates and fees need to be controlled by this council. That's important that we have the fiscal responsibility and the fiscal oversight to make sure that we have fees and rates that our users down there will be paying, but that can be controlled by the city. Impact fees are going to be necessary to assess the capital costs. It is what it is, and we're prepared to do that. And again, the mantra's always been, as we talked about Sonoran Valley many times in the past, that growth has to pay for growth. So that is our number one approach. When you look at service options, I mentioned, private water utility. We didn't think that was appropriate here. We could use what I call the standard approach, where you would assess an impact fee and have City of Goodyear employees down there. I think that's a little problematic as we start to develop the utility, given its geographic location and disconnect from the city. So we looked into a hybrid scenario, and we've had several meetings with Montage. I've kind of bounced ideas, kind of brainstormed how we could best service that, because there's going to be an immediate need here. Construction will start as quickly as possible as we expand our service areas. So we're going to need to get that infrastructure into the ground and hopefully have new customers, by the fall of next year if all goes as planned. Within the hybrid scenario, again, it's a municipal system. It has to be. We need to have that control as a city. But we're looking for a true public-private partnership. We want to have a three-party agreement where we work with the developer, the city, and then an equity partner or a capital partner that will help us maintain and meet the needs of that burden, that utility burden that will be placed on us. As I mentioned earlier, rates and fees have to be controlled by council. We need to have that authority. But the thing that we're looking at is for this firm to come in and finance, construct, and operate the infrastructure. We'll own it from day one. It'll be city pipes, city treatment plants. We'll have that control and oversight. But we're looking at one firm to come in and to operate this thing. Essentially, turnkey solution is kind of one of the terms that I'm looking at. We think there can be some efficiencies gained by that, by having one entity involved, bringing the private approach to municipal government, looking at it like a business from day one, being fiscally responsible. I think there can be some efficiencies as it relates to construction. We can get a little creative with that. And then with that organization and that team in place, from day one, you can set things right at the beginning. I mean, we're going to have a very small utility day one. We'll have some treatment plants and not a lot of customers, but it's a very robust development. Montage has great things planned, and as it grows and becomes a very large facility, if you can set those things early in the process, fiscally responsible, and have a rate structure that recoups the true operating cost, so there's no subsidization from existing, either the existing ratepayers or the general fund. I think that's critical, and that's what we want to try to do. The big thing is it's supported by the developer, which is, I think, critical to this. It's something that we want to do as a team. We think it's important. We've got a lot of steps to go. This is a very brief presentation. I just wanted to throw that out there. Just to let you know what we're thinking for our next steps is we want to complete a comparative study. We want to look at it and confirm that there are efficiencies to be gained. I believe that there are. Montage believes that there are, but we want to make sure, trust but verify. So we want to do a study, not anything thorough that's going to take 3 years, but we want to make sure that what we're doing is the right thing to do. We want to confirm those efficiencies, and then we want to solicit qualified partners through a procurement process. It will be municipal funds through an impact fee, where you'd assess an impact fee. So the municipal government needs to be involved there, and there's procurement guidelines that need to be followed. At this point, I'm not sure if it's going to be an RFQ or an RFP process, but we're going to start to develop the language and work with procurement to go out and solicit a partner. And then once a firm is selected, start to negotiate an agreement. The one thing that we're looking at is we'd like to mirror the master development agreement as it relates to the term of service. So the master development agreement is a 30-year agreement with 2 10-year options, and the utility infrastructure will be built out. It will follow growth, obviously. We'll have a little bit of seed money put in at the beginning to build the first package plants and to build the first well sites, but then we'll match capital funding as growth calls for it. So we won't go out and build a 28 million gallon treatment plant and then have 13 customers. We don't need that size of a facility. We don't want to operate that size. So we'll build it prudently. But we want to have that mirror the master development agreement because there's some synergy there. And then the other thing I think that is critical is the city needs to be provided what I'm calling an off-ramp. And what that is that allows us to reassess where we're at, even if the partnership is going strong and it looks like we want to continue this. We need to have those off-ramps in place. So if the city, if there's a change in city government, if the council has a different approach 5, 10, 20 years down the road, that this off-ramp will allow us to have the third party exit the scene and then have the city come in and hire staff either through a contractor or hire city employees to go in and start to operate those facilities. So we think that's critical to that. And then under any scenario, we've got to obviously bring this back to you for your approval. We're going to keep you involved in this process throughout the various steps. We have a tremendous amount of work to do. We want to get started immediately once you guys, go on break and you go on vacation. Unfortunately, I won't be able to. That's okay. But we do have a lot of work to do, and I just wanted to bring this up to your attention to make sure that, and I guess to check your temperature, to make sure that this approach, this non-traditional approach, would be supported by this council. Obviously, at the end of the day, it needs to be a good deal for the city, and if it isn't, we'll look at other options. But we really believe that this is something that's a little non-traditional, but I think can reap great benefits for the city.
Sean, do we get an opportunity to buy out that partner if we want to?
See, this is the great thing. There will be no buyout. We'll own the asset from day one.
We will actually own it, even though we have this partnership that's operating everything. We could push them out if we wanted to?
Correct. What typically happens now is if either the city builds the infrastructure from day one, we bring forward a CIP budget, and council approves that, and when we go out and spend those dollars to build, say, a well site as an example. If we bring in and other times, depending on the phasing of a development, a developer may front that capital, build that infrastructure, and then what we typically do as a city is we give them the credits, the offsets on the impact fees to reimburse them for that capital cost.
Okay.
So under a scenario where we exercise an off-ramp, there may be some excess capital. They may have built a $50 million plant, a $50 million plant, and only had recouped $40 million in impact fees. So there would be a repayment of impact fees over time after they exit the operation of the facility. But we do that currently with developers now. If there's a funding of capital, they make that back over time, and it's as growth occurs. The city won't be asked to sign a check for X amount of dollars. It'll be payback as development continues to grow. So we own it from day one. There's no buyout or payback. It's city infrastructure, which is key.
How involved is Montage at this point?
They're a partner at the table constantly. Tim.
Tim Keenan, 6720 North Scottsdale Road. Mayor and Council, we've already kind of gone down this road in terms of forming this public-private partnership on this, because I think it's in our both best interest that we have a sewer and water system that is both as good for the citizens of our community, mutually, the private and public partnership. So we've been talking about this now for about 6 months. I'm ready to go, in terms of doing it the traditional method if the council doesn't approve this, but I think what this really does is lets us put dollars into other areas, other infrastructure to make this a more successful community.
Any further comments, questions?
Is there anything that we can look at that we can pattern a plant currently?
Is there someone else that's done this before, is what he's saying? We have.
I've done something similar in terms of the satellite system, or in terms of the partnership.
Something similar that we can pattern in an operation such as
partnership. What we're going to be doing in this session while you're on break is looking at areas where we've had other examples of that, both on the financial end and then the operations of it. There are places in the United States where these type of companies, they do the same process, and we can bring that back to you at that time.
Surprise has American Water that does O&M for them in a portion of their city, as well as Phoenix's plant that just built the surface treatment plant up at Lake Pleasant.
Right.
Was also built and operated by American, I think, as well. So there are examples in the state that have public-private entities.
And I think the type of, equity partner, or I'm not sure what we would call this third party, I think one of the criteria that we would look at is that they've done this before, that they've been successful at this. We wouldn't want to partner up with someone that's never done it and thinks that they can do it and thinks that they can do a really good job, we would look for that successful track record. And why reinvent the wheel when you can mirror someone else's success? So I think that's one of the things that the comparative study will be looking at is to mirror other agreements and then to prove out that this is a good deal for the city, because if it isn't, we just can't do it.
So, if I can draw a conclusion from that, because you've been so polite during your presentation, would it have to be a low bid process, or you're talking about a qualified?
I would, without stepping on the procurement officer and Larry's toes, I would look for an RFQ process where you go out and you get a qualified firm and then negotiate from there. I think that the city would get a much, I don't want to say a better deal, but I think if you don't drive it by price, you drive it by quality, I think you'll get the price you want at the end of the day.
Are we talking about two different rate zones then within the city service territory? A rate zone down south and a rate zone
Potentially,
north?
I think we need to look at this as a satellite service territory. We need to look at what it costs to provide service in that satellite area. And I think if there's a policy level decision that needs to be made, that would be made by the seven of you. But I would recommend as a staff person that we look at it, in a traditional standpoint, that what are the true costs, and then determine what those are, and then turn it over to you and make a recommendation to you that we believe this is the rate that it needs to be, and then from there you can take it and do with it as you see fit.
I would imagine over years we might see costs equalize between the two areas of the city, the north and the south, but up front I would think it might be
I just
quite
think
a
at
bit
the
more
beginning,
expensive
people
in the
were
south.
worried about that. I think we had a citizens' comments about that area. It was on utilities, and would this side of Goodyear be paying for their side? And so I think that is a concern.
I think it's a valid question to ask, and I think that's why we're looking at it to mirror the master development agreement. We have a 30-year model in place from day one, because it will be a 30 to 50-year development. So we wouldn't look at going in and building all of the infrastructure in the first 10 years and then wait for the development to happen. We would build it prudently, and then also by having a longer-term agreement that allows us to move costs and to shift costs that may be very prohibitive in years 1 through 5, say, out into the further out, so that there's cost recovery. And then the big thing that we need to have in the rate is we need to have repair and replacement. We need to constantly be saving some of those monthly water and sewer bills that we charge our customers in repairing and replacing our infrastructure. The first time in, you get it through the development community, through an impact fee. The city really doesn't truly pay for it. The growth pays for it. But the second time around, we're not going to have that luxury. So we're going to need to have that money and that financial standing so that we can reinvest.
What point time-wise are you talking about?
Well, the life cycle cost of equipment. You may have a pump that, we had a well go down and you need to replace it. You're a bit of a slave to the process, but pipes typically, I would say 50 years. Treatment plants typically 25 years, but there's ancillary equipment in all of those things that can go out within, a 5 to 10 year life cycle. So you need to have that reinvestment of capital constantly, because what we need to avoid is we don't want to run out, say it's a 30-year agreement, and at the end of 30 years, they leave town and we've got a dilapidated, rundown facility. We're going to constantly reinvest in that, so that when we exit this partnership and it's fully built out, we have a very robust utility that's operating at maximum efficiency.
Very good. Well, we have, right now, a pattern not to follow.
Yes.
Correct. And that's one of the benefits to Sonora Valley is the next piece of pipe's the first piece, and we can learn from all of our lessons, the good things and the not-so-good things that have happened here in the existing city, and duplicate the good and hopefully not repeat the bad.
I'm going to state the obvious, but I would encourage, and I think everybody probably concurs, maybe you don't, but I'd encourage us in any way, shape, or form to keep it out of the corporation commission system, i.e. the total private sector. It's just a big, we're, as we are seeing it with Lipscomb, it's a huge challenge.
That's why it's critical that the city controls the resource.
That's why this off-ramps work so well. That's the whole design, the
Correct.
off-ramps.
Correct.
And also, I think we learned a lesson also that people have to understand that it costs money, and that we need to make the beginning buyer to know that's going to buy the first house there, that rate's not going to stay that same, that it may increase, and make them more realistic on what it costs to have that
Correct.
type of service.
Agreed.
Okay, just to quickly, I assume the capital costs of this are frightening for the water and wastewater down
Yes.
there. You're going to fund the capital through CFDs and impact fees, or no?
No, we look to avoid CFDs. That's the thing here. We would assess an impact fee to recover the cost of capital. So we would calculate, a 5 or a 10-year impact fee. We haven't gotten there yet, so this is just kind of freeboarding here. we would assess an impact fee based off of the amount of capital that we would build over that period of time, and then be able to recoup that capital cost through an impact fee, and then have repair and replacement built into the user fee, so that as the customers move in, they'll be able to cover the operation and maintenance costs of that infrastructure that's been built, and then also essentially over time pay for its replacement. That's how a true utility should work, and avoid CFDs, improvement districts, those type of things.
So the bonding will come from,
The actual funding would come from the equity partner themselves. It would be repaid to that equity partner through impact fees, through a contribution from us, and then through user rates. So what we'd like to do, I think getting down to your question is, be able to use those CFD dollars available for other types of infrastructure for this project. It's a very creative way to fund this water and sewer system, but I think in the long run, it really spreads dollars other areas for the project and for the Sonoran Valley region as a whole.
Can I follow on that? Is the assumption the equity partner and the O&M partner are the same? It is?
It is today, yes.
It could be.
But it could be two separate entities. You could have an equity partner and you could have an O&M partner.
Could, but I think it'd be easier for everybody if it was one. But there's one other point here I think is real important to remember. That's, I guess, maybe different from some other projects. Our development agreement is 30 years with those 10-year extensions. Our life of our project, though, is probably 50 years over that 10,000 acres. So we're going to be out there with you during that whole life of this relationship, whoever this equity partner is. It's
Not with all of us, but maybe some of us.
Well, Garrett will. I don't know if I'll be around, but Garrett will.
Yeah, you will.
So,
maybe a couple of us.
but I just want to make that point. It's not one of those ones where we're out here for 5 years and we've built this 25 million gallon wastewater treatment plant, and we're long gone. We're with you here, and that's why I think it's important in this private-public partnership that we work together and find other ways of doing things.
i.e. thousands of feet from residential property and not popping up manholes in the soil.
I'm not
Sorry, I had to put my jab in.
Okay, I think I did hear, though, that the council really does want Sean, with your consultant, to identify a Jim Albu-like qualified person to pick the equipment that's going to be in this water and wastewater plant, okay? It's got to be a top-drawer person who's shooting for the equipment that is going to survive and work effectively for years, unlike another example we have. And so that's crucial.
Agreed.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we're in 3 minutes. We'll start our regular meeting. Okay, this meeting is adjourned.